I'm filled with admiration for you and deep gratitude for you about the great contributions you've made to the most needy people on earth.
I seriously considered calling you and asking you to do a portrait of me. Those bathroom sketches are wonderful, but at my age, I think I should keep my suit.
We're glad to be here. God bless America, and thank you very much. Too long?
What I know is true about President Bush, and I hope my successor will say about me, is that we love this country and we do our best.
Whatever challenges come before us, I will always believe our nation's best days lie ahead. God bless.
All the living presidents joining the opening of the Bush Library. He's given everyone a chance to reassess the Bush legacy. This week, we're going to debate that in a little bit on our roundtable. Let me introduce everybody right now, joined by George Will, as always, Democratic strategist Donna Brazile, former House Speaker Newt Gingrich, the outgoing mayor of Los Angeles, Antonio Villaraigosa, and ABC's Matthew Dowd. And I do want to get to that in a little bit, George, but let me begin with what was happening all week long at the nation's airports. There were long lines, and as we learned, the sequester had started to kick in. Air traffic controllers started to be furloughed, created a debate on the floor of the House over how to fix it.
We're here because of a colossal failure of leadership and the ability to manage resources.
How can we sit there and say 4 million Meals on Wheels for seniors? Gone. But that's not important.
George, the president and Democrats had insisted that there had to be a comprehensive solution to lift the sequester. Boy, you saw Congress act in close to record speed. The furloughs hit at the beginning of the week. By Friday night, a fix had been passed so the air traffic controllers can come back.
The comedian Lily Tomlin has a character, the bag lady, who says, no matter how cynical you get, you can't keep up. Look what happened this week. 2 million Americans fly every day, so you can, in a very few days, you've got a real constituency of the irritated out there, but more important, 535 members of Congress fly regularly, and this was going to inconvenience them, which was unthinkable. So the FAA, having said this was all necessary because the sequester required it to live on the amount of money it had in 2010, now it was chaos to live on 2010 appropriations. Some whistleblowers within the FAA began sending out emails saying they were instructed that this had to be as painful as possible on the theory that if the government annoys Americans enough, Americans will say we should give the government more money. I don't follow the reasoning there. But the long and the short of this is, George, the sequester is now going to be here for a very long time because they're going to find ways to make it administered more rational.
That means it'll be a Swiss cheese sequester, doesn't it, Donna?
Absolutely, George. But this sequester will have real impact on real people in real time, not just members of Congress, but people who work for the Park Service, medical research, as the NIH began to make those cuts. Its impact in Meals on Wheels, kids who are in kindergarten. So I really do think that Congress needs to take a second look at this. Otherwise, every month we will be faced with another crisis.
But it seems like, Mr. Speaker, that the incentive that has been set up is to kind of have these rifle shot fixes going forward, that whenever something seems politically perilous, we'll go in and fix that one by one.
Look, this was a real victory for fiscal conservatism. They didn't give the money back. What they said is, here's another pot of money that doesn't affect people nearly as much. We're going to cut exactly the same amount, but we're not going to do it stupidly. You had the Attorney General announcing that not a single one of his 60,000 employees would be furloughed. Not a single one. You had the Secretary of Transportation announcing that he had to cause the maximum pain possible. Now, the average American looked up and said, this is just stupid management. And I think what you'll see is a rolling series of fixes, none of which back off on the total amount of the sequester, but which make more sense out of how to save the money.
But doesn't that mean the politically weakest are going to bear the biggest burden?
Of course.
Not necessarily. It may mean that the most corrupt are going to bear the biggest burden. It may mean the dumbest are going to bear the biggest burden. When you look at a $4 trillion government, you can find lots of really stupid things to quit paying for.
So Mary calls it a victory for fiscal conservatism.
No, I don't think so. I think it's a colossal failure of leadership, like Micah said. It really is. We've had balanced budgets and deal with structural deficits in our city and in cities all across the country. We've done it in a balanced way. You don't have to completely eviscerate services. You can make the efficiencies and find the savings that you need, and that's what the government needs to do here. I mean, the problem with the Congress is that they're both so fixated on ideology and orthodoxy that they can't work together. And so I do think for most of us, we look at them and we say, what planet are they from? Why can't they work together? Why can't they fix what's broken?
Well, they did work together here.
Yeah, well,
pretty overwhelming.
That to me is the most amazing thing. We constantly ask for bipartisanship out of this Congress and this administration, and the only way they're bipartisan is to do something for themselves. And it's amazing the speed at which they did that. We have this horrible shooting where all these children die in Connecticut. We can't pass gun control legislation. But, oh, by the way, you're about to get delayed at the airports through some small budget cuts, which I still don't understand why we make policy the way we make policy. Everybody knows there's a fiscal crisis in this country. Everybody knows we don't have the revenue to meet the expenses in this country. Somebody has to bear pain. But we act in Washington like nobody has to bear any pain. So as soon as somebody bears pain, we're going to take it back from them. That's fundamentally the problem.
George, you asked the question. Isn't it the case that in a showdown like this, the articulate, the well-organized, the affluent, the complaining middle class benefits? Of course, big government is always the servant of the strong enough to organize and make its levers work. The 2 million people who fly every day are disproportionately middle class and upper middle class. They know how to complain, they know how to organize, and they know how to contact their congressman.
And the long-term unemployed are going to see their benefit checks cut.
By 11%. Those on Medicare will see their benefits reduce. And of course, this is going to have a real impact on GDP and job growth.
Let's talk about the broader questions about the president's agenda and the congressional agenda going forward, especially in the wake of the Boston Marathon bombings. There were some suggestions early on after the bombings that perhaps immigration reform should be slowed down. Dan Coates on this program last week. Paul Ryan pushed back on that notion this week.
We have a broken immigration system, and if anything, what we see in Boston is that we have to fix and modernize our immigration system for lots of reasons. National security reasons, economic security reasons. For all those reasons, we need to fix our broken immigration system.
Mr. Speaker, what is going on here? You've seen the Gang of Eight in the Senate build up some momentum for comprehensive immigration reform, yet in the House, you've got the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, Bob Goodlatte, saying, no, I want to move with single bills that fix discrete portions of the problem. What does that mean for the legislation going forward?
I think the more people study the comprehensive bill, the harder it's going to get to be. I mean, this is one of those. Remember, we did this under Bush. We had the McCain-Kennedy great breakthrough, 800 and some pages, terrific press conference, and then somebody actually starts reading the 800 pages. I think you'd be vastly better off to do what Chairman Goodlatte's doing. Take one piece at a time. I do think it ought to be fixed. But I think it ought to be fixed one piece at a time, out in the open, with amendments, where you actually know what it means. And I distrust deeply 800-page bills crafted by staff and then launched with great publicity with nobody, actually none of the senators, I'll bet, has read the bill.
Maybe the 8 have.
Maybe.
844 pages to be exact.
Correct.
We do not do comprehensive well. Comprehensive energy plans, comprehensive health care, comprehensive immigration. It winds up like a Rubik's Cube, and it's almost impossible to solve. Or to change the analogy, it's like a Calder mobile. You jiggle something here and things start jiggling all over there. The fact is, you can take employer verification in a separate bill, H-1B visas for the talented in a separate bill. You can take border security. You can take guest worker programs and break it up into bite-sized.
You can see the mayor jumping out of his seat right there. I think the fear of a lot of proponents of immigration reform is if that happens, then the pathway to citizenship will never happen.
Well, that's right. And just last year we had every Republican candidate calling for the self-deportation of 11 million people.
Whoa, that's not true.
Let me finish. And the fact of the matter is, for a city like mine, 1 out of 10 people is undocumented. 400,000 of the 4 million, 42% foreign born. 57% of the people in my city have at least one immigrant as the head of household. But importantly, 44% of all the new businesses that are started by immigrants. We've got to fix this broken system. I agree, we don't do comprehensive very well. Well, they don't do comprehensive very well. But the fact of the matter is, we're not going to have an immigration bill that doesn't have a pathway to citizenship. Look, even this bill says 13 years it's going to take. The vast majority of polling has said people think 5 years is an appropriate period of time. This is very tough on border security. It's very tough on the hurdles that that you have to overcome to become a citizen. You have to pay back your taxes. You have to have a background check. If we do it piecemeal, we'll have people shoot it like Swiss cheese, and you'll never get a bill.
First, I want to give the speaker some credit for, during a hard primary, spoke out compassionately on what we had to do on immigration. And then got beat up for it in the primary. So he did do that. I think that there's consensus on the politics of this on both sides of it. Democrats know that this is something that they want to do and have to do, good public policy. Republicans now know that if they're going to be a party that goes into the next generation that's going to be at all more than a minority party, they're going to have to do something that feels like they're going to outreach to Latinos.
I think Republican leadership believes. I'm not sure rank and file House members agree with that.
What I think, though, is we're going to have immigration reform. It's going to happen this year. It's not going to be slowed down. We already have a consensus on it on both sides of the aisle. The president wants it. The leadership in Congress wants it. It's going to happen. What the elements of it, it's going to happen this year.
But it shows a split between the National Republican Party that would like to see immigration reform passed this year and the congressional Republicans who want to slow it down, to look at it piece by piece, to analyze it, to see if they could pull it apart.
And I'm hearing two more conservative Republicans here are much more skeptical than Matthew Dowd is.
It's not just that. I mean, it's like watching Obamacare disintegrate. These giant bills that make great press conferences and everybody in Washington dances together and we're all having a wonderful time, they become law. Laws ought to actually be out in the open. You ought to actually know whether they're going to work. You ought to actually have, every single thing that the mayor wants to get done can get done in a series of specific bills. The challenge is, if you have an idea so bad you have to hide it in a comprehensive bill, why should we pass it?
That is going to be the question going forward. Also, a lot of questions about the president's leadership as he pushes all of these as well, especially after the failure during the bombings of the background checks in the Senate. It's created a whole bunch of comparisons, especially in the New York Times, I noticed, to the president. They say he's not enough like LBJ. Front page story this week went on and said, if he cannot translate the support of 90% of the public for background checks into a victory on Capitol Hill, what can he expect to accomplish legislatively for the remaining 3.5 years in office? Robert Dallek, historian and biographer of President Lyndon B. Johnson, said Mr. Obama seems, quote, inclined to believe that sweet reason is what you need to use with people in high office. That contrasts with Johnson's belief that what you need to do is back people up against a wall. Of course, George, Will, people remember it was mostly Democrats that Lyndon Johnson was backing up against the wall, and he had massive majorities in both the House and the Senate.
Yes, and he'd carried 44 states in the previous election and all of that stuff. The New York Times suffused with nostalgia for Lyndon Johnson. It's one of the comic moments of our time. But beyond that, Lyndon Johnson did understand that politics is a transactional business. You give something, you get something. This president has an inordinate faith in the power of his rhetoric. He campaigned against Scott Brown, against Chris Christie, against Bob McDonnell. He campaigned hard for the Democratic candidates in 2010. They got shellacked. He campaigned for Obamacare. It's still very unpopular. His rhetoric is overrated. It is no basis for government.
Donna?
Still, this is a president, the first since Dwight Eisenhower to win 2 consecutive elections with over 51% of the vote. So, but look, Congress is broken. It's very difficult to have a relationship with members of Congress when they are worried about their next primary and not worried about what they're going to accomplish. I think this president is trying to do the right thing in terms of outreach, putting together sensible policies, but they are no dance partners to start a relationship with.
I think the president, he's had a lot of great speeches that he's given, but I think they've made a mistake by not having a relationship, not trying to build one-on-one relationships in Congress and saying, we're going to go out and talk to the country. We're not going to worry about Washington, D.C. This president has never built relationships outside of saying, I need your vote tomorrow. He hasn't, it's all been photo ops with Congress. He hasn't reached out. He hasn't consistently said, come to Camp David, sit down with me, let's talk about this. I think if that president had that ability, he's got a 1 on 10,000 ability. He does not have a 1-on-1 ability.
I'm going to go to failure leadership again. First of all, he doesn't have a vote in the Congress, and I'm not suggesting that he couldn't work harder
He's the president of the United States. He should be able to
work those congressional members. But I think the Democrats and the Republicans, by the way, because there were a number of Democrats that didn't vote for universal background checks. They ought to be ashamed of themselves. 90% of America, the vast majority of NRA members support universal background checks. There's got to be a middle ground somewhere where we can all agree. So you put a little on the president, but I put a lot more on the Congress.
Senator Manchin says he's going to come back with. Mr. Speaker, let me ask you about this. Of course, you've been in the middle of countless negotiations in the House. Would this kind of personal politicking really make a difference on an issue when people are facing such pressure at home?
Sure. I mean, it makes a huge difference in part because you begin to learn what you can and can't do. I mean, you don't set up goals that are hopeless. And the voting pattern on gun control has been extraordinarily clear for the last 50 years, with very rare exceptions. In the end, the people who care deeply about the right to bear arms view that as a central issue in their lives, and the people who vaguely say yes in polls don't vote on it. And what happens is, and I know this is a horrible idea in Washington, people actually do go home. They actually listen to the folks back home, and the folks back home say to them, don't do that. Now, that's not a bad thing.
In the case of background checks, this was an issue that the NRA supported until the president
in the
got
late
behind
90s.
it.
That's right.
I'm just reporting that I think actually if you were to go and look at somebody like Max Baucus, you would find that in Montana, the way he voted was overwhelmingly approved.
I think many members of Congress have bought into a myth that doesn't exist anymore. I think in some cases that's true, Mr. Speaker, but I think most what's going on gun control is there's not this huge, vehement group of people out there saying, I'm going to defeat you if you vote for background checks, I'm going to defeat you if you vote for high-capacity magazines. There's not that. I live in Texas. I'm around a lot of people that shoot guns. I own 5 guns. There's nobody out there saying, don't do that. What there is, though, is a group of folks in Washington that are scared of their shadow on this issue, both Democrats, some Democrats, and a lot of Republicans. The myth doesn't exist anymore, but they're afraid to go launch themselves through it and do something.
And whatever happened to courage and doing the right thing? Notwithstanding where the popularity polls are.
What you're saying is a minority stood up against an overwhelming majority and lacked courage? I thought that was the definition of courage. Second, the gun control measures would have passed if they bore any discernible connection to preventing something that was the cause of all this argument, which was Newtown. They never connected the measures with the problem.
And that could be the biggest challenge going forward. We also saw all the presidents come together this week. All the living presidents come together. They open up the Bush Library. It comes at a time we had a new ABC News Washington Post poll this week that shows since he's left office, President George W. Bush's approval rating starting to climb, gone from 33% when he left office in January 2009 up to 47% today, sort of climbing back into respectable territory, George Will.
Well, the American people want to think well of presidents and ex-presidents. The problem with the Bush legacy is the tensions within it. Arguably, his greatest decision was the surge, but the surge was to correct for the disastrous implementation of the invasion of Iraq, which itself never should have happened, we now know. Second, his greatest legacy are 2 superb Supreme Court candidates, the nominees, now justices. On the other hand, one of them came after a disastrous suggestion, Harriet Miers. In Afghanistan, you had an invasion you had to take, but you had terrible mission creep afterwards, and we got into the business of nation building. The prescription drug entitlement, the first major entitlement ever passed without a dedicated funding source, aggravated the coming crisis of the welfare state. And his favorite piece of legislation, No Child Left Behind, offended every conservative instinct by further nationalizing a quintessential state and local responsibility.
Matthew, Dad, you worked for the president for several years, broke over the Iraq War.
Well, yeah, and I was there for the first 5 years of the administration, as you say, broke over the Iraq War. I think it was a great moment. These are always great moments that happen with the 5 living presidents there. They pay respects regardless of party. That libraries and presidential institutions become an important part of our cultural and research and conversation. And I think the president, reflecting back, had done a number of good things. What he did for aid to Africa, as Donna has pointed out, what he did in the aftermath of Katrina, and a number of things. And I think what you saw was everybody thinks this is a good man. But the problem that I saw in this whole thing, as we had that day and everybody focused on it, it's as if you were asking the people that got off the Titanic, they say, other than that, how was the trip? And The Iraq war was a disaster. We spent over $1 trillion. We lost thousands of lives. I had a son that served there. We lost thousands of U.S. lives, thousands of lives over in Iraq. And the Iraq war, for at least 20 years, is going to affect. It's already affecting our foreign policy in Syria. It's caused the president to not say, well, I don't know if I can do this because of what happened in the Iraq war. It's affected our domestic policy because of the lack of funds, the lack of ability, and it polarized the country. And so I think we pause for a moment and we say, yes, he's a good man. But in the end, the Iraq war was such a disastrous decision and affected this country so dramatically. His tie to history is going to be completely tied to that.
Mr. Speaker?
Well, I think the thing you saw for a brief moment there with his father captured the heart of George W. Bush. This is a person who tried very hard to do what he thought was right, has an enormous sense of decency. And I think, as he said in his closing thing that you had on the show, he really loves America. I think I agree with the critique. I mean, I think people are going to be pretty tough about the record, but I don't think they're going to be very tough about the man. And I think there's a real difference in those two.
That was clear. You saw that all day on Thursday, exactly.
You know, he got off the stage in 2009 and said, you know what, goodbye, so long. I'm not going to inject myself in the day-to-day politics or the policy of the country. I think that was for the good, not just of his legacy, but also something maybe future presidents should do. Let the other one govern.
And Mayor, you see him sticking to that in all the interviews this week, would not touch a policy issue.
Yeah, well, and you got to respect him for that. I actually did like to see, for once, Democrat and Republicans together acknowledge the man and not just his policies. I'm with you, Matt. I think his biggest mistake was getting into that war, and I didn't vote for him either time. But you have to respect the presidency. I do. I think it's important for us and in a democracy. And I thought it was a good moment for a respite from the kind of partisanship you see here that gets you sick.
Certainly was that. Okay. We're going to take a quick break.